15 years, that's how long they managed to keep me out of every single family reunion, every birthday, every holiday gathering, every chance to sit around a table and be reminded that I still belong somewhere. And then one ordinary Saturday morning, as I walked down the marble staircase of my mansion, there they were, standing at the gate like nothing had ever happened, like the past decade and a half of silence, rejection, and abandonment could just be erased by the fact that I had built a billion-dollar tech empire, and I froze not from shock at seeing their faces but from the sheer audacity it took for them to show up uninvited, smiling, as if they had earned the right to walk back into my life. Before I take you deeper into this story, I want you to pause for a moment and think, have you ever been excluded by the very people who were supposed to love you the most, the ones who should have been your first circle of safety? If you have, drop a comment below, because your voice matters here. And maybe sharing your story will remind someone else that they're not alone. My name is Olivia Carter, and 15 years ago I was the unwanted one, the quiet girl pushed aside, the name erased from invitation lists, the face cut out from photographs tucked into family albums, the daughter and cousin no one cared to see again. And if you're wondering how someone goes from being excluded like that to owning a company valued at over $10 billion, well, you'll find the answer in both the pain they caused me and the fire that pain lit inside me. I grew up in a family where tradition meant everything. Sunday barbecues at my uncle's ranch, Christmas dinners with 20 cousins, summer reunions that lasted 3 days with laughter echoing across the fields. But all those images you're picturing, I wasn't part of them, not after I turned 18. For reasons that to this day still sting, they decided I didn't belong. It started small, subtle enough that I almost missed it. One year I didn't get the group text about the 4th of July cookout. My aunt brushed it off as a mistake. The next year my cousin's wedding happened and I wasn't invited. "We didn't think you'd want to travel," my mother said with a shrug. By the 3rd year it wasn't subtle anymore. I remember calling my dad on my birthday, hoping he'd at least pretend to care, and his exact words were, "Olivia, you're too busy chasing nonsense dreams, we didn't think you'd have time for family." That was the moment it sank in. I had been cut off, not legally, not with a piece of paper, but emotionally, spiritually, socially, I was no longer theirs. For 15 years I spent Christmas mornings alone, eating takeout, trying to convince myself that the silence of my phone wasn't proof of my worthlessness. For 15 years I watched old photos of family gatherings pop up on social media, each one a reminder that I had been replaced, erased, discarded. And yet, while they laughed around campfires, I was sitting in coffee shops drafting code, building prototypes, chasing investors, falling down, failing, and getting back up again. Nobody believed in me except one person. A college roommate turned best friend who told me over and over that rejection could either bury me or build me, and I chose the second option. That pain of exclusion? It became fuel. Every ignored phone call, every unanswered email, every empty chair at the dinner table was a log on the fire that kept me going when sleep deprivation and debt almost crushed me. And so when I stood on those marble steps of my mansion and saw them after all those years, smiling like they were entitled to the life I built, I didn't just see family. I saw ghosts of every lonely night, every tear I swallowed in silence, every piece of myself I had to rebuild from scratch. And I knew right then that this was not going to end the way they expected. When I look back now, it's almost comical how ordinary the details of their betrayal seemed. Little slights wrapped in polite words, everyday moments that, when stacked together, built a wall higher than any mansion gate could ever be. Because betrayal rarely arrives as a thunderclap, it sneaks in like a whisper, like the time my aunt quietly pulled my photo from the family collage to make room for another cousin's baby picture, or when my mother scheduled the annual reunion on my birthday 3 years in a row and then acted surprised when I wasn't there, telling everyone, "Well, Olivia never makes time for us," as if I had been the one doing the excluding. And then there was the Christmas Eve when I mailed gifts, carefully chosen, carefully wrapped, to each of my nieces and nephews only to have the packages returned to sender unopened, a cold reminder that my effort, my love, had no place in their world. They didn't scream, they didn't cut me off with formal declarations, no, they simply stopped treating me as though I mattered. And when you are erased slowly like that, it hurts more than any loud rejection because you begin to wonder if you were ever real to them in the first place. I remember sitting alone in my tiny studio apartment back then, scrolling through Facebook photos of smiling faces clinking glasses, captions reading "Family is everything," while my own father's hand rested proudly on the shoulder of cousins who had mocked me for choosing computer science over a real job, and I laughed bitterly through the tears, not because it was funny, but because the hypocrisy was so sharp it felt like a blade against my skin. They called me a dreamer, they called me stubborn. They said I would waste my life chasing ideas no one cared about, but what they never saw was the hours I spent coding in dimly lit rooms, surviving on instant noodles and determination, holding on to the vision of building something that would one day matter. And yet, even in the darkest nights when loneliness pressed against my ribs like a vice, I still held on to a flicker of hope that maybe one day they would remember me. Maybe one day they would call. Maybe one day I would hear someone say, "We were wrong, Olivia, come home." But that call never came. 15 years passed like that. A cycle of holidays missed, birthdays ignored, milestones celebrated alone, until I stopped expecting anything at all, until silence became the only language my family spoke to me. And then, as if orchestrated by some cruel twist of fate, everything changed, not because they grew hearts but because I grew success. My company launched a groundbreaking AI platform that revolutionized healthcare data. Investors poured in, headlines called me the youngest female billionaire in the state, and suddenly the girl they had erased from their albums was everywhere, in magazines, on Forbes lists, giving keynote speeches in front of thousands. That's when the texts started trickling in, vague at first. "So proud of you. We should catch up sometime." Messages from numbers I hadn't seen in over a decade, and for a brief moment I wanted to believe, I wanted to think they had finally seen me, but the illusion shattered the day they showed up at my mansion. It was a bright Saturday morning. I had just returned from a board meeting and was still in heels, coffee in hand, when the intercom buzzed and my security guard's voice came through, hesitant. "Miss Carter, there's a large group here claiming to be your family. They're insisting on speaking with you." My first instinct was to laugh, to tell him to send them away. But something in me needed to see their faces, needed to look into the eyes of those who had left me behind and measure just how much nerve it took to come knocking now. I told him to let them in. And so I stood at the top of the staircase as they flooded my foyer. My parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, even the same siblings who had blocked me on social media years ago. All dressed like they were attending a gala, plastered smiles on their faces, arms wide as if I might run into their embrace. For a moment there was silence, the kind of silence that hums with unsaid truths, and then my father broke it with a voice far too casual for the gravity of the moment. "Olivia, sweetheart, look at you, we always knew you'd make it big." And the room spun because those were the same lips that once told me I was wasting my life. My mother chimed in next, her tone syrupy sweet. "Family should be together, darling, and now that you're in a position to give back, it's time we rebuild what we lost." That's when I realized this wasn't about reconciliation, this wasn't about love, this was about money, plain and simple, because within 5 minutes of stepping into my home they started making demands, suggesting I buy houses for struggling cousins, pay off debts for uncles, fund business ventures for siblings. One even had the audacity to say I owed them because without their tough love, I never would have become so resilient. The air grew heavy, their smiles more forced, their eyes darting around my marble floors and crystal chandeliers as if they were already dividing it up in their minds, and I felt something inside me harden. Not anger exactly, but clarity. A piercing awareness that this was the moment I had been unknowingly preparing for all these years. They wanted me to forget 15 years of silence, to erase 15 years of being unwanted, just because now I had something they wanted. But what they didn't know was that I had been keeping receipts, I had been documenting, saving, preparing, and if they thought they could just walk in here and rewrite history, they were about to learn the kind of lesson only betrayal can teach. For a moment as I stood there in my own living room surrounded by people who had once erased me, I felt myself shrinking back into the 18-year-old girl who stood outside the window of a family reunion watching laughter spill out from a house I was no longer invited into, and it terrified me because after all the success, after all the accolades and the billions of dollars in valuation, after the headlines that called me unstoppable, there was still a piece of me that trembled at the thought of being unwanted, and I hated that they could still make me feel small. My mother leaned closer, touching my arm with the kind of fake tenderness she had mastered decades ago, whispering, "It's time to let go of the past, darling. We're family, and family helps each other." And those words dug into me, not because they were kind, but because they were a lie wrapped in silk. 15 years of silence is not family. 15 years of unopened gifts and unanswered calls is not family. 15 years of pretending I was dead to them until Forbes proved otherwise is not family. But standing in that silence, I realized they expected me to fold, to apologize for my own success, to hand over checks as if money was the only bridge between us. My chest tightened, my throat burned. I wanted to scream, to throw them out immediately. But another part of me whispered, wait. Wait and watch. Wait and gather every ounce of truth you've carried for 15 years. And so instead of screaming, I smiled, and that smile must have startled them because my father cleared his throat, uncomfortable, asking if they could stay for lunch, acting as if this were a casual visit. I agreed, not because I wanted them there but because I needed time to think, to map the battlefield that was forming right inside my home. As the hours ticked by, they grew bolder, their words sharper beneath the sugary tones. My cousin Mark bragged about how his new business could flourish if only I would invest $500,000. My aunt hinted that her mortgage was crushing her, and that a successful niece could surely rescue her. My brother, the one who hadn't spoken to me since college, leaned back in his chair and said with a grin, "Think of it as redistributing wealth, Liv. You wouldn't want to be the kind of billionaire who forgets her roots." Roots. The word sliced through me because what they called roots had been nothing but chains. I excused myself to the restroom, but really I went into my private office and locked the door, leaning against it with shaking hands, tears pressing at the corners of my eyes. I wanted to collapse. I wanted to curl into the old ache of being unwanted. But then my gaze fell on the framed photo on my desk, the only family picture I kept, me and my college roommate, now my business partner, arms around each other on the day we signed our first investor contract, eyes bright with belief. She had told me back then, "Olivia, pain is a weapon if you know how to wield it." And suddenly the trembling stopped. My tears dried. The fear twisted into steel. They thought I was cornered, but in reality I had never been more prepared. For years I had documented every attempt at contact, or rather every absence of it. I had folders of returned packages, unopened letters, email threads that showed their refusal, even voicemail recordings where relatives told me not to call back. I had all the receipts. And more than that, I had built a new kind of family, the chosen kind, the colleagues who became siblings, the investors who became mentors, the friends who showed up when blood did not. Those were my people, my tribe, my proof that I wasn't alone. So when I unlocked my office door and walked back into the dining room where my so-called family lounged like vultures, I no longer felt like the 18-year-old they discarded. I felt like the woman who had risen from their rejection, the CEO who had outworked, outlasted, and outloved their indifference. Still, I let them talk, let them dig their own grave with every entitled demand. My father finally slammed his hand on the table, declaring that as the eldest he had a right to oversee family wealth management, which was his coded way of saying he wanted to control my fortune. That was the breaking point, the precise second when my resolve crystallized into action. I leaned forward, met his eyes, and said calmly, "If you want to talk about family and wealth, then we'll do it properly, with witnesses, with records, with every truth laid bare. Tomorrow. Here. Noon." They hesitated, but greed blinded them. They agreed, probably imagining I would announce some grand gesture of generosity. But what I was planning wasn't charity. It was justice. That night I barely slept, but not because of fear. I spent hours in my office assembling documents, printing photos, pulling out every scrap of evidence that proved 15 years of abandonment. I called my lawyer, my assistant, my closest allies, and told them to be at the mansion the next day. I even asked the house staff who had served me loyally for years to stay present, Because I wanted witnesses not just of blood but of loyalty, the kind that cannot be bought with checks or erased by silence. When dawn broke, I looked at the stack of binders on my desk and felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. Not the fragile kind that comes from pretending pain didn't happen, but the fierce kind that comes from facing it head-on. And so as the sun climbed higher and the clock ticked toward noon, I prepared not for a family reunion, but for a reckoning. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of my study and the air felt electric, as if the entire house knew what was coming, because this wasn't just another day, it was the day I would finally stop carrying 15 years of silence on my shoulders and place it back where it belonged. And as noon approached, I sat in my leather chair surrounded by binders of proof, each one labeled meticulously with years of abandonment, unopened letters, returned gifts, screenshots of social media, posts that paraded their happiness while I was erased, and even voice messages where relatives told me in cold tones never to call again. My lawyer arrived first, a steady presence in a dark suit, followed by my assistant who carried an extra hard drive containing digital backups of everything, then my best friend and business partner who squeezed my hand and whispered, "This is it, Liv. This is where you take it all back." I nodded because I wasn't nervous anymore, I was resolute. At exactly 12 o'clock the gates opened and my so-called family swept in again, this time with less fake sweetness and more entitlement, their smiles thinner, their eyes sharper. My father marched in like he owned the place, my mother close behind adjusting her pearls, and a few cousins carried notebooks as if they were about to take minutes at a business meeting. They didn't even say hello, they launched straight into their agenda. "We've been talking," my father began, "and we think the best way forward is for you to set aside a family trust, say $50 million to start, that way everyone benefits and the family legacy is preserved." My jaw tightened, but I let him finish, and then my uncle chimed in about how I should buy vacation homes for the group so we could reconnect. My brother suggested I pay off his medical school loans despite the fact that he had cut me off completely 15 years ago. And even my mother had the audacity to suggest I transfer my company shares to a family council so decisions would be more balanced. Balanced? That word almost made me laugh, because what balance had there been when they excluded me from birthdays, when they posted family photos with captions about unity while leaving me out in the cold? Their demands grew bolder by the minute, the room filling with voices overlapping, some even hinting at legal action if I refused. One cousin threatening that the press would love to hear how heartless I was if I didn't help blood relatives in need. That was their final escalation, the last desperate push to corner me, and I knew the moment had come. I raised my hand and the room fell silent, more from curiosity than respect, and I said evenly, "If you want to talk about family legacy, then we need to tell the truth about family history." With that, I gestured to my assistant, who placed the first binder on the table and opened it. Inside were photos of packages stamped "Return to Sender," letters unopened, cards torn, all addressed to the very people now sitting in front of me. I watched their faces stiffen as I slid the pages toward them. "This is from the first 3 years after you cut me out," I said calmly. "Every holiday I tried, every birthday I reached out. This is your handwriting rejecting me." My mother's face flushed red, but before she could speak I nodded to my lawyer, who laid out the next binder filled with emails and voicemails where they explicitly told me not to call, not to come, not to expect a place. The room grew colder, their confidence beginning to crack, but I wasn't finished. My best friend connected the hard drive to the big screen in the living room, and suddenly the walls echoed with recordings. My uncle's voice saying, "Olivia's not invited, she doesn't fit in." My cousin mocking me for chasing nonsense dreams. My father telling relatives I was a disgrace we don't need around. Each voice was undeniable, their own words condemning them. By now some of them were stammering excuses, others sitting frozen, but I pressed on, relentless. "You talk about family legacy," I said, my voice steady. "But this is the legacy you created: 15 years of abandonment, 15 years of erasure. You don't get to rewrite history now because I succeeded without you." The silence that followed was heavy, but even then, blinded by greed, one of my cousins tried to recover, sneering that none of this mattered, that the public would still see me as selfish if I didn't share. That was the moment my lawyer slid a final envelope across the table, a cease and desist order already prepared, legally barring them from harassing me, making false claims or attempting to exploit my name. Their mouths dropped open, shock rippling across the room. My father's voice cracked as he tried to protest. "You can't do this, we're your family." But I leaned forward, eyes locked on his, and said with a calm fierceness I had waited years to unleash, "Family is who shows up, not who shows up when it's convenient. You made your choice 15 years ago. This is mine." The room was thick with tension, every pair of eyes on me, some burning with anger, others darting nervously toward the binders and the screen still frozen on the words they had once said so carelessly. And for the first time in 15 years I wasn't the one shrinking in silence, I wasn't the outsider begging for recognition. I was the one holding the truth in my hands, and it was heavy, yes, but it was also liberating. My father tried to stand, his voice rising. "You can't twist this against us, those were just words said in the heat of the moment, we didn't mean them." But before he could continue, my lawyer pressed play again and the screen flickered to a video clip from a reunion years ago. One I had never attended but had somehow obtained from a mutual acquaintance. And there on the screen was my mother raising a glass, smiling, saying, "Here's to family, all of us who matter." And the camera had panned across the table where laughter erupted, and then someone, my cousin Mark, leaned into frame and muttered, "Except Olivia, she's not really family anymore." And the room had erupted in cruel chuckles. The sound of that laughter filled my living room now, and I watched their faces drain of color, because it wasn't just private words anymore. It was a celebration of my exclusion, undeniable proof that they had chosen to erase me long before I built my empire. My cousin Mark stammered, "That was a joke, it was years ago." But my best friend's voice cut through the silence. "A joke is only funny when everyone is laughing, but she was crying alone while you laughed without her." That twist landed like a punch, and for once they had no retort. I looked at each of them and saw not family but opportunists scrambling to justify cruelty now that it was exposed. And I realized they had no power left because the receipts were louder than any demand. Still, I wasn't finished, because part of true revenge is not just exposing the past but reclaiming the future. I pulled out another document, this one a notarized statement from one of my aunts who had long since left the country but had witnessed countless conversations about excluding me. And in it she confirmed under oath that the decision to cut me off had been deliberate, that my parents had orchestrated it to teach me a lesson, for pursuing my own path instead of following family expectations. When I read those words aloud, the room went dead silent. My father's mouth opened and closed like he might deny it, but my mother's face betrayed her because shame flickered there for just a second before she covered it with anger. "Enough," she snapped. "This isn't about the past, this is about now, and right now you're our blood and you owe us." I felt a surge of clarity wash over me, the final piece of steel sliding into place, and I leaned forward with a calm smile. "No, this is about then and now, because the way you treated me then determines who you are allowed to be in my life now, and the answer is no one." Gasps rippled through the room, but I wasn't done. I turned to my lawyer, who handed me a set of documents already signed and sealed, a legal trust ensuring that not a cent of my fortune could ever be claimed by anyone not specifically named, and then I looked at them and said, "If you thought you could guilt me into giving you money, you're too late, every safeguard is already in place, you will never touch what I've built." The twist of finality was visible in their eyes, some furious, some desperate, and then came the moment that sealed it all. My security team stepped forward and placed a small envelope on the table. Inside were copies of cease and desist orders with each of their names, legal warnings that any further harassment, threats, or defamation would result in lawsuits and restraining orders. My brother slammed his fist down, shouting that I couldn't erase family like this, but I stood tall and said, "You erased me first. I'm simply returning the favor." And with that, the confrontation ended not with screams but with silence, the kind of silence that comes when truth is undeniable and power has shifted entirely. They filed out one by one, some muttering curses, others too stunned to speak, and when the last door shut behind them, I felt a weight lift off my chest, a weight I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. For the first time in 15 years, I wasn't defined by their rejection. I was defined by my choice to reject the cycle of manipulation. That was the twist none of them expected. Not cruelty, not revenge in the way they imagined, but the simple, unshakable boundary of a woman who had finally realized her worth. When the last echo of footsteps faded down the marble hallway and the heavy front doors closed with a thud, the silence that settled over my mansion was unlike any silence I had ever known, because for 15 years silence meant absence, rejection, loneliness, but now it meant freedom. It meant the clean, sharp line between what was and what will never be again. I stood there in the center of my living room, surrounded by the binders, the screens, the documents, and I felt no guilt, only release, as if I had exhaled a weight that had been pressing against my lungs since I was 18. My lawyer shook my hand firmly and said it was done. The protections were airtight, the cease and desist orders enforceable, the trust irrevocable. And then he left quietly, knowing this was not just legal business but something far deeper. My best friend stayed behind, sitting on the couch, sipping the last of her coffee, her eyes shining with pride. She said softly, "They wanted to make you feel like that girl again, the one standing outside the window, but you turned the window into a wall and made it clear they can't climb it anymore." Her words sank into me like medicine, because she was right. The true revenge was not about shouting or humiliating them. It was about never allowing them to hold power over me again. And as I looked out the tall windows to the sprawling gardens beyond, I realized this house, this empire, this life was not a trophy for them to covet. It was proof that I had survived and thrived without their approval. The days that followed carried the aftershocks, because predictably they tried one more time to reach me, first with phone calls, then with emails, then with long rambling letters claiming misunderstandings, begging for reconciliation, but every attempt was intercepted by my lawyer, and each one only reinforced the same truth: they didn't want me back, they wanted what I had built, and since the trust was ironclad, there was nothing left for them to take. So eventually the noise dwindled and then disappeared, replaced once again by silence, but this time I welcomed it, because it was no longer the silence of exclusion, it was the silence of peace. I began to notice small things changing in myself. I slept deeper, I laughed more freely, I stopped checking social media for glimpses of people who had long since chosen to erase me. I stopped imagining that one day they might call with sincerity, because I no longer needed that fantasy. I had chosen my family already, the ones who stayed when there was nothing to gain, the ones who sat through long nights of failed code, the ones who invested not just money but faith into me. Those were my people, and felt good to let that be enough. One evening I hosted a dinner in the very same dining room where my relatives had hurled demands, only this time the table was filled with my chosen family, my team, my closest friends, my partner in business. We raised our glasses not to blood but to loyalty. And when I looked around the table, I didn't feel the old ache of who was missing. I felt gratitude for who was here, and that realization was perhaps the sweetest victory of all. Because revenge at its core isn't about destruction. It's about reclamation, reclaiming your power, your dignity, your right to define your life. And as I sat there laughing over shared stories, I knew I had reclaimed everything they once tried to strip away. And so when people ask me if I regret closing the door on blood relatives, I tell them no, because blood means nothing without love, loyalty, or respect, and family is not defined by genetics, it is defined by presence, by who shows up in your darkest nights and stays until dawn. My mansion no longer feels like a fortress built against them. It feels like a sanctuary built for me, and those I choose to welcome inside. And every time I walk down those marble stairs, I no longer see ghosts at the gate, I see freedom. I see the girl who once stood outside in the cold, now standing firmly inside her own life and smiling. That is the consequence they never expected, that the more they tried to demand, the less power they had, and that the truest revenge was not cruelty but peace, and in that peace I finally found my home. Looking back now, it almost feels unreal that the people who once turned their backs on me had the nerve to walk through my doors and demand a share of the life I built. But maybe that was the final gift they unknowingly gave me, because their audacity forced me to face the truth I had been too afraid to name for years, the truth that I was never waiting for their love, I was waiting for my own permission to move on. And when I finally granted it, I discovered a freedom so much sweeter than revenge. It was peace. For 15 years I carried the weight of their absence like a chain around my neck, always asking myself what I had done wrong, why I wasn't good enough, why my own family could laugh and feast without me. But the truth is, their rejection was never about my worth, it was about their limitations, their fear of difference, their need to control. And once I understood that, I stopped asking questions that had no answers and started living a life that required none of their approval. That's the part one want you to remember if you're listening right now with your own scars. If you've ever been cut out, erased, ignored by the very people who are supposed to hold you close, hear me when I say this: your worth is not measured by their recognition, your value is not defined by their acceptance, you do not need their invitation to exist fully, you already belong simply by being here. The sweetest revenge isn't about slamming doors in their faces or throwing their cruelty back at them. It's about choosing to live so fully and so freely that their absence no longer wounds you, it no longer defines you, it no longer controls even a second of your joy. My story may have unfolded inside marble halls and boardrooms and legal trusts, but at its heart it's the same story many of you carry, the story of realizing that blood does not guarantee love, that family can be chosen, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to set a boundary so high that no amount of guilt or manipulation can climb over it. I don't wake up each morning thinking about what they lost, I wake up thinking about what I gained: clarity, resilience, peace, and the knowledge that I am surrounded by people who show up not for what I have but for who I am, and that is priceless. So if you've been waiting for a sign to let go, let this be it. You don't have to keep opening doors to people who keep slamming them in your face. You don't have to chase approval from those who only remember you when it's convenient. You don't have to carry the weight of being unwanted. Because you are wanted, you are worthy, and the life you build in spite of rejection will be more powerful than any apology they could ever give. And now I want to hear from you, because stories like mine are not rare, they are just rarely spoken. Have you ever had that breaking point where you realized you couldn't keep giving chances to the people who kept taking them away? Have you ever found strength in walking away from those who should have been your closest but chose not to be? Tell me in the comments below, because your story might be the one that gives someone else the courage to finally set themselves free.